You ever get that feeling when like you finally figure something out? You know what I mean? It's not just like knowing the answer. It's more like when something clicks and it's so satisfying. And that got us thinking for this deep dive. What is the relationship between the effort our brains put into learning and how much we actually want to learn more?
I think that's a really interesting way to put it. A lot of times we think about motivation as this like thing that you need to have before you can even start learning. You're either motivated or you're not. But the research that we've been diving into, especially this Felden Cognitive Load Motivational 2019.pdf article, it kind of shows us that the connection between motivation and learning is way more dynamic than that.
Right. It's not just a one-way street.
Exactly.
So we're going to be talking about something called cognitive load theory. We'll call it CLT because it's a mouthful. And we're going to be looking at how it connects to this whole idea of motivation and what drives us to learn. Now, CLT really focuses on what's happening inside your working memory when you're trying to learn something new. Can you kind of break down that basic idea for us?
Yeah, so CLT at its core is really about how instruction impacts learning when we consider that working memory has a very limited capacity. So think of your working memory as that mental scratch pad that you use in the moment. It can only hold a small amount of information, and really just for a short period of time, unless you're like actively rehearsing that information.
It's like when someone gives you a phone number and you're trying to remember it before you write it down.
Yeah,
If it's too long, you're going to start forgetting parts of it.
yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing when we're talking about learning. If your working memory gets overloaded, that information is not going to make it into your long-term memory.
That's right. So for learning to be successful, you need to get that information from that scratch pad into long-term memory. And CLT basically says if the way that information is taught overloads working memory, then it's going to be a lot harder to learn. However, an important point here is that the things that you already know can really change this. So if you already have a lot of knowledge about a topic, then your working memory can handle more new information because all of those connections that you already have in long-term memory, they act like these shortcuts. And that frees up space in your working memory. That's why, if you think about an expert in any field, they can learn new stuff in their field so much easier than someone who's totally new to it. The demand on their working memory is just way lower.
That makes perfect sense. So someone who's been, say, playing the guitar for years is going to learn a new song way faster than someone who's never even held a guitar before.
Oh,
Now, the article mentions that cognitive load has two main aspects. And I have to admit, this tripped me up a bit when I first read it. They talk about mental effort, and then they also talk about just cognitive load itself.
yeah, it can seem a little bit confusing.
It seems a little redundant.
Yeah. So the way to think about it is cognitive load is the total burden that's placed on your working memory from the way that something's being taught. And that is relative to your prior knowledge. So it's really an external demand. Mental effort, on the other hand, is the cognitive resources that you actively use when you're trying to learn. So it's how much you engage and dedicate yourself to that process, and how much mental effort you're willing to put in can actually tell us something about how motivated you are.
Okay, I think that distinction's starting to become a little bit more clear in my mind. So if the cognitive load is really high, maybe the instructions are clear or the topic itself is just super complicated and dense,
Hmm.
your working memory is going to get overwhelmed just trying to process all of that. And that means that you won't really have much mental space left over to actually make those connections and get that information into your long-term memory. It just makes the learning process a lot harder.
That's exactly right. All those mental resources that you could be using to build lasting connections and make schemas, they're all being taken up just trying to deal with what's right there in front of you.
Right.
And that brings us to talking about the types of cognitive load.
Yes, the different types.
Yeah.
So we've got intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and germane cognitive load.
Right. Those are the original three.
Sounds like a recipe for a very complicated cake.
Yeah, so intrinsic load is basically how inherently difficult the material is. So like how many moving parts there are. Extraneous load is the load that comes from the instruction itself that doesn't help you learn. So things like confusing diagrams or having extra information that you don't need. And then germane load was thought of as kind of like the good type of load. It's the load that comes from you actively processing the information and making sense of it. But more recently, researchers have kind of been thinking about this a little bit differently.
Okay, so how has that perspective changed over time?
Yeah, so nowadays people tend to lump intrinsic load and what was called germane load together. So intrinsic load is still talking about that complexity of the material, but instead of talking about germane load separately, we now talk about germane resources. And these are the parts of the instruction and the ways that you use your working memory to really build those strong connections and get things into long-term memory. So it's not so much about the type of load, it's about how effective the instruction is at getting you to use your working memory in a way that really helps you learn deeply.
Got it. So it's all about managing that total load on your working memory,
Yes.
whether it comes from the topic itself or from the way it's presented. If it's too much to handle, your learning is going to suffer.
Absolutely. And the article goes on to talk about something that's actually really tricky, which is how do we measure these different types of cognitive load? So, a lot of research relies on self-report questionnaires where they ask learners how much effort they felt like they put in or how hard different parts of the instruction were.
Like when you take some sort of online tutorial, and then at the end, it asks you to rate how challenging it was.
Exactly. So, for example, there's the scale that Ayers developed, which is specifically trying to get at intrinsic load, or the one that Lepping and colleagues made, which is more detailed. And it has questions that try to separate intrinsic load from extraneous load and from what they call germane load. It even has questions about mental effort. So, all of this research has been helpful in understanding how learners see the different demands of learning. But it's also shown that people have a really hard time telling the difference between intrinsic load and extraneous load. So it seems like our subjective feelings of mental effort, they don't always perfectly match up with those theoretical categories. It's kind of like when you're carrying a heavy backpack, you just feel tired overall, but you can't really tell how much of that weight is from the stuff that you need and how much of it is just junk that you're carrying around.
That makes perfect sense. If you're having a hard time understanding something, it's difficult to know if it's because the concept is just inherently complex or if the way it's being explained is just, well, bad.
Yeah.
So how does all this cognitive load stuff connect back to our original question about motivation? Where does that link come in?
Yeah, this is where the connection starts to get really interesting. The article talks about how the mental effort that you put in while you're learning creates this direct connection between your working memory and how motivated you are. Because think about it, if you're willing to really focus and put in that effort, that suggests that you are actually driven to engage with what you're learning. So the authors talk about three indicators of motivation that are tied to this mental effort. The goals that you set for yourself. Are you setting challenging goals or not? The mental effort itself that you actually invest in learning.
Yeah.
And then your persistence. So do you keep going when things get difficult?
Right. So it's not just about some vague sense of motivation. It's showing up in how we actually approach learning.
Exactly. And along with all of this, there are also these beliefs that we have about our own abilities that are really tied into our willingness to put in that effort. So things like self-efficacy, which is basically how much you believe that you can actually succeed at something, and how much you value a task. And that value can come from just finding something interesting or because it helps you achieve other goals that are important to you. And we've already talked about how our prior knowledge impacts cognitive load. But it's important to remember that prior knowledge also plays a big role in these motivational beliefs. So, for example, Tobias found that your existing knowledge can actually account for about 20% of why you might be interested in something.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it makes sense though, right? Because the more you already know, the easier it is to connect new information to what you already know,
Yeah.
and it makes it more engaging. But here's a really interesting point that the article makes about self-efficacy. We often think about self-efficacy as this thing that comes first. Like, I believe I can do it, so I'm going to put in the effort. But some research actually suggests that it might work the other way around. That our self-efficacy is actually the result of our past performance and how much effort we felt like we put in. So, for example, Hailakari did some studies, and so did Eggstad and Confer, and they found that self-efficacy wasn't always a good predictor of how well someone would do.
So it's not so much, I believe I can do it, therefore I'm going to succeed.
Yeah.
It's more like, I did well and it felt like I had to work hard. Now I believe I can succeed again.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important difference. And building on this idea, Vancouver and some other researchers, they found that when students were given feedback that was too positive and it inflated their self-efficacy, but their actual skills didn't match up, their performance could actually get worse over time. And they thought that this might be because the students were then underestimating how much effort they actually needed to put in. So it seems like our estimated level of effort that we think we need based on what we already know, that might actually be a better predictor of how much effort we're willing to invest than just how confident we feel in general. And that brings us to this concept called anticipated investment of mental effort, or AIM.
AIM. Sounds like it's basically predicting how much brain power you're going to have to use for something.
Yeah, it's kind of like forecasting how you're going to engage with a learning task. Salomon is the one who first came up with this idea of AIM to try to explain this relationship between mental effort and learning and instruction. And his idea is basically that we make these judgments about how hard we think the instruction is going to be, and then we decide how much mental effort we're going to put in based on that judgment.
So it's like you're doing this little mental assessment of how much of a challenge it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And Salomon, he identified two main things that affect Lean. The first is your perceived cognitive demand. So that's basically how much mental load you think you're going to have to deal with. And the second is, of course, your self-efficacy. So do you believe you can handle that demand? And he did this really classic study where he compared learning from watching television versus reading printed text. And even when the actual information was the same in both cases, people generally thought that watching TV was easy, and they thought that reading was harder. So what happened was they ended up putting less mental effort in when they were learning from TV. And they didn't do as well on tests afterwards. But when they were reading, they put more effort in and learned more. And the really interesting thing was that self-efficacy actually had a positive relationship with effort and achievement in the print condition, but a negative relationship in the video condition. So people felt more confident about learning from TV, even though they weren't actually learning as much.
That is fascinating. And I think that's something that we can all relate to. Our assumptions about how easy or hard it's going to be to learn something can really affect how much we actually get out of it.
Totally. And Sanamo and some other researchers, they found similar effects with other media, like interactive videos and computer-based learning. So it seems like our past experiences with different ways of learning and our beliefs about how easy or difficult they're going to be, they can really shape how we perceive the task and how much we ultimately learn. So going back to this idea of A, if you have high self-efficacy, you might think you don't need to put in as much effort. And if you have low self-efficacy, you might think you need to work extra hard. And while we can self-regulate our effort while we're learning, which is important, research by Yo and Neil shows that there comes a point where if something seems way too hard, we might just give up. So if we think that the load is going to be way beyond our capacity, we might not even try.
It's like looking at a mountain that you think you could ever climb. You just wouldn't even bother starting.
Exactly. And there's another interesting study by Licarezos and Caliuga that looked at direct instruction versus more constructivist approaches, which are more open-ended. They found that with direct instruction, students reported putting in less effort and feeling more confident. But it didn't necessarily mean that they learned any better. So it seems like feeling less mentally strained can be good for getting people started, but it doesn't always translate to deeper understanding. So to really get the whole picture of motivation, we need to bring in another important framework, which is expectancy value theory.
No, it's expectancy value theory.
Yeah.
EVT, I've heard of this before. Can you give us a little bit of a refresher?
Yeah, so EVT is a really popular model that focuses on these two main drivers of motivation. The first is your expectancy of success. So that's basically, can I do this?
Right.
And then the second is the value that you place on the task. So do I want to do this? And EVT says that motivation doesn't come from just one of these things. It comes from how they interact. And interestingly, research has shown that expectancy is actually a better predictor of how well someone will achieve something, whereas value is more about what we choose to do.
So you might be really good at something. So you have a high expectancy for success, but if you don't see any point in doing it, if it has low value for you, you're probably not going to do it. And on the other hand, you might really want to do something. It has a lot of value for you. But if you don't think you can succeed, if you have low expectancy, you might not even try.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So let's break down these ideas of expectancy and value a little bit more. So expectancy is all about your beliefs, about your ability to succeed at something. It's really similar to self-efficacy, which we talked about before, and also this idea of competence from self-determination theory, which is this feeling that you can be effective in what you do. And all of these beliefs, they're really powerful. They predict what kinds of learning activities we choose, how much effort we put in, whether we keep going when things get tough, how we regulate our own learning, and in the end, how well we do.
So where do these expectancy beliefs come from? I mean, we're not born knowing whether we're going to be good at coding or playing the piano or whatever.
Right. They come from a lot of different places. Our past experiences, whether we've succeeded or failed at something before. That's a huge one. So if you've done well at something in the past, you're more likely to believe that you can do it again. Vicarious learning is another big one. So that's basically seeing other people who are like you succeed. So that can boost your expectancy. Encouragement and feedback from people around us, and even our own physiological and emotional states can impact how much we believe in our own capabilities. So, like if you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, it can be really hard to believe that you're going to succeed.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, how about value? What makes something valuable to us?
Yeah, so in EVT, value has a few different components. The first is intrinsic interest. That's basically just doing something because you find it fun and enjoyable in itself. The second is utility value, which is when you see a task as useful for achieving your goals. And then the third is attainment value, which is how much succeeding at a task lines up with your identity and who you are. So like if you're really good at something that you see as central to your future career, that would have high attainment value.
So something can be valuable to us because it's fun, because it helps us get where we want to go, or because it reinforces how we see ourselves.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned the Felden Cognitive Load Motivational 2019.pdf article earlier, and that title also mentions cost, expectancy value cost theory. So how does cost fit into all of this?
Yeah, that's a super important addition. And it's a more recent way that people have been thinking about this theory. So in the past, cost was often seen as part of value. So the effort you put in and the things you have to sacrifice, those were all weighed against the benefits. But more and more research has shown that cost is actually its own thing. It can affect both your expectancy and the value that you place on something all on its own. People have used statistical techniques like factor analysis, and that's shown that cost is psychologically different from expectancy and value. So now we have this more complete model called expectancy value cost theory, or EVCT.
So cost isn't just the effort you put in. It's a bigger consideration of what you're giving up or what negative experiences you might have.
Exactly. So researchers have identified a few main types of cost. There's effort itself. So that's just the mental and physical energy that you have to use for the task. Then there's what's called outside effort, which is the effort that you have to use to juggle the task with all your other responsibilities.
Yeah.
Another big cost is the loss of valued alternatives. So what other fun things or important things are you missing out on because you're doing this particular task? And then finally, there's psychological stress. So that's the anxiety and the worry that you feel about potentially failing. And the funny thing is that which of these costs feels most important can actually change depending on whether you think you're going to succeed or fail.
That makes a lot of sense to me. If you're going for something really hard,
Yeah.
you're probably mostly focused on how much effort it's going to take and what you're missing out on. But if you're really worried about messing up, then that anxiety is probably going to take over.
Absolutely. And unlike expectancy and value, which tend to make us more motivated, they usually encourage us to do things. Cost usually does the opposite. It makes us want to avoid things. So research has shown that when people think something's going to cost them a lot, they're less likely to try to achieve related goals, and they're more likely to give up when they face challenges. There's a study by Zhang and colleagues that actually found that cost is its own separate thing, and it can predict bad academic behaviors like procrastinating and setting avoidance goals, and it can actually predict lower achievement overall.
So this idea of cost, how does it all connect back to what we were talking about with cognitive load? Is this where the article starts to bring everything together?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The authors say that task-specific cognitive load is basically the same thing as task-specific cost in EVCT, especially when you're talking about how hard the task is and how much effort it requires. So think about this. Let's say you have two learning tasks that are actually equally difficult in terms of the material. So they have the same intrinsic cognitive load. But one of those tasks is presented in a really confusing way. Maybe there are distractions or the instructions aren't clear. So there's a lot of extraneous load. That second task is probably going to feel a lot harder. It's going to take more effort. And that means it'll have a higher perceived cost. On the other hand, if you have a task with lower extraneous load, even if the material is just as complex, it's going to seem like it costs less.
So extraneous cognitive load, it's like this motivational cost. It makes learning harder and less fun.
Yeah, exactly. And then the article goes on to look at studies that actually changed the cognitive load of tasks on purpose to see how it affected people's motivation. So one example is this study by Steele Johnson and colleagues, where they found that how much cognitive load people experienced during a learning task that actually affected the relationship between their learning goals and their self-efficacy afterwards. And remember that study by Lucarizos and Kaliguga that we talked about before, where they looked at how much instruction students got? They found that different levels of cognitive load, the way that students reported it, that actually predicted their self-efficacy after the task, even if they learned about the same amount. So if they reported lower cognitive load, they also tended to have higher self-efficacy.
Right. And then there were those findings from Felden and colleagues and also from Huang that seemed kind of contradictory at first.
Yeah.
Felden found that less extraneous load led to better performance and bigger improvements in self-efficacy. But Huang found that higher cognitive load, and this seemed to be more about the complexity of the material itself and maybe deeper processing, that led to more learning and more self-efficacy. So those results seem opposite.
Yeah, so on the surface they do. But I think the key here is to think about what type of load is being manipulated. So in Felden's study, they were specifically trying to reduce extraneous load. That's the kind of load that makes learning harder, and we've talked about how that can feel like a cost. Huang's study, on the other hand, seems to have been more about intrinsic load and using germane resources. So it's about the effort that's needed to really understand hard material and make those connections. And that can actually be good for learning. So the authors of the article that we're talking about, they think that learners can kind of tell the difference between these types of load. And they see extraneous load as more of a cost than the effort that's needed to understand complex material when it's presented well. It's also possible that when we successfully deal with more intrinsic load, that makes us feel more competent and like we've mastered something. And that can boost our expectancy beliefs.
So it's not just about minimizing all effort. It's about being smart about what kind of effort we're putting in. So reducing that frustrating extraneous load, that can make us more motivated. But engaging with difficult material in a way that supports us, that can also be good for our motivation.
Exactly, as long as we don't overload our working memory.
Right. And the authors of the article, they say that thinking about EVCT and CLT together actually benefits both of these areas of research. Because when we see extraneous cognitive load as a cost, we can start to connect what we know about motivation with what we know about cognitive load theory. And that helps us get a more complete understanding of how learning works. And it challenges this traditional idea that we have to be motivated before we can do anything hard. It's showing us that how much cognitive load we experience can directly affect how we feel about our own abilities. And sometimes that even happens separately from how much we actually learned.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It's huge.
Yeah.
So it's not just that you need to be motivated to learn, it's that the actual experience of learning, especially if it involves a lot of extraneous load, can make you less motivated to learn similar things in the future, even if you manage to understand the material eventually.
Exactly. And thinking about cognitive load as a cost also gives us some cool new ideas for research. So it can be pretty hard to manipulate someone's intrinsic motivation directly,
Right.
but we can actually manipulate extraneous load in a more objective way. So like you could compare the same learning material presented with and without a lot of distracting elements.
Right.
And then we can see how changes in this motivational cost affect other motivation variables like self-efficacy and persistence.
That's such a clever way to approach this. So by tweaking the cognitive load, you're basically changing the cost, and then you can see how that impacts motivation.
Exactly. And this raises some interesting questions for the future. Like, do different ways of creating extraneous load, like splitting your attention versus dealing with confusing language, do those have different effects on motivation? And then, of course, we need to learn more about the motivational effects of intrinsic load and how to design learning experiences that help people engage with complex material. The article also talks about how we need to get better at measuring both cognitive load and motivation.
Yeah, how so? It sounds like what we have now is a bit limited.
It is. So the authors are saying we should be using more of these event-specific measures of motivation and self-regulated learning. So instead of just asking people how they felt after they finished a task, we should be asking them questions while they're actually learning. So things like microanalysis, where you interview people at different points, like before they start, while they're working, and right after they finish, that can give us a much better picture of how their motivation is changing over time.
So instead of just saying, how motivated are you to learn this topic, you might say, right now, as you're working on this problem, how confident do you feel about solving it?
Exactly. And this idea of looking at motivation in the moment, That fits really well with theories of self-regulated learning, which say that different mental processes become more important at different points in a task. And these more immediate measures, they're also better at picking up on changes that happen because of different teaching methods. And the cool thing is that we can measure cognitive load in a similar way. So we can measure it during the learning process, after specific parts, or at the end. And there are tools for this, like the rating scale that Paz developed. And we can even use behavioral or physiological measures to get a more real-time look at cognitive load. So the authors are suggesting that we use these motivational event measures together with different ways of measuring cognitive load, like self-report, behavior, and even physiological indicators. And that can help us get a much more detailed and dynamic picture of how effort and motivation are working together while people learn. And this more complete data can help us really understand how the features of a task, motivation, learning behaviors, and achievement, how they all relate to each other.
Wow, this has been quite the deep dive.
Yeah,
Really insightful.
thanks.
So the big takeaway here is that the mental effort that we experience, it's not just about processing information. It's actually shaping how motivated we are to learn in the future.
That's exactly right. And when we see cognitive load, especially that extraneous load, as a kind of motivational cost, it helps us understand why some learning experiences make us want to keep going, and why some make us feel drained and like we never want to do it again.
It really makes you think differently about your own experiences as a learner. Think back to the last time you had to learn something really challenging. How did the effort that you had to put in affect how much you wanted to learn more about that topic or things like it? Was the cost worth it? I think this gives us a really interesting new perspective on how we learn and how the way the information is presented can really affect our motivation.
I think so too.
Thank you so much for breaking all this down for us. It's been really illuminating.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
Really fascinating stuff. And for our listeners out there, what are your thoughts? How do you see the effort involved in learning, impacting your own desire to learn more? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Until next time.
See you then.